Hello, and welcome back to another discussion in Christian Evidences, or Christian Apologetics. This is the second part of our discussion on the historical reliability of the Gospels. You might remember in our first part, I said there's three basic lines of evidence that I want to use in talking about the reliability. The bibliographical evidence, which looks at manuscript evidence we've talked about. The internal test, which looks at internal characteristics within the gospel that argue for its being historically reliable. And the external test. Today I want to pick up with talking a little bit more about some of the internal evidence we've discussed in our previous lecture, and then go into some of the external evidence as well. I've already discussed the date and authorship of the Gospels, that I've argued for an early date, and I've argued for traditional authorship and showed there's reasons to believe that. Okay, and I've also talked about some of the internal stylistic characteristics we see inside the Gospels. The third thing that I want to discuss is I want to talk about the Jewish oral tradition. Okay. Now you might remember from a previous lecture, we talked about form criticism, which argues that during the time period between the events of Jesus' death, resurrection, and his life, and the time when the Gospels were actually written, there were many, many years where, in fact, the story of Jesus was being passed around orally, okay? And through the process of this being passed around, it got embellished upon, it got elaborated on, and a lot of the stuff that ended up in the Gospels is stuff that didn't really happen, according to form criticism. They were fabrications or embellishments that were developed in small communities. That's what the form critic says. Well, while form criticism holds that the oral tradition embellished and distorted the gospel stories, okay, several scholars, especially in recent years, the past 20 years or so, several scholars have argued that in fact the oral tradition was faithfully preserved, okay, that it didn't embellish upon everything at all, okay. Now, you got to step back for a second into the time of Palestine and the time of the ancient world, okay, where we lived in an oral culture. Today we live in a literary culture. We depend upon literature to give us our information, or even more recently today, we live in the digital times where we depend upon a digital means to get us our information. But back in the ancient world, they depended upon oral means for where they got most of their information was. And because of that, memorization of large amounts of material was very, very common in the ancient world. They had extensive capacities to be able to memorize a huge amount, especially in the rabbinic tradition of Judaism. Okay, males were expected to know long passages of scripture completely by memory. If you were a rabbi, you often memorized whole books of the Bible completely by memory. Okay, in a culture where that was just part of the culture, it wasn't uncommon to have that, and the memorization was very, very faithful to the actual text itself. Now, do we have reason that in fact Jesus and his disciples had that same kind of relationship? Well, yeah, we do, for a couple of things. First of all, Jesus' relation to his disciples was very similar to the relation of a rabbi to his students, okay? And so his disciples would have been used to the idea of memorizing much of the stuff that Jesus taught them, memorizing the events that occurred there, okay? Also, the Gospels arose in this Jewish milieu where there was a respect for tradition and the oral word, especially if they thought that that word had come from God, that they would memorize that material. Seeing the disciples seemed to believe that idea that Jesus was God, therefore you would have expected them to have memorized a lot of the material there by itself. This might in fact even explain the special role of the apostle in the early church. His authority was based on the fact that he actually heard directly from Jesus, and he could maintain control over this oral transmission. What you really had then is you had this repetition of the same stories along with the oral techniques, and this would establish a structure in which the stories could be transmitted. I'd call these structured stories under eyewitness control. In other words, as we retell a story over and over, the story begins to gain a particular structure. It begins to stay a particular way. I've been teaching now for 30 years. Oftentimes I'll tell the same stories in class, even the same jokes. Okay, they come out exactly the same way year after year after year. That's because I've told them so often, they just kind of hold that structure there. These structured stories were under the control of the apostles, the disciples at the particular time that they were there. They were able to control and maintain and make sure the stories were kept pure, okay? The New Testament writers, as a matter of fact, often use the tradition of oral culture in their writings. We talk about how they were handed over, or how this was delivered unto me, or how I received this from the apostles, we're told. That's all the language of oral tradition that was given there. Now, there's also evidence that there was a certain amount of writing that went on, that Jesus' followers may, in fact, have taken notes of some of his teachings, and maybe some of this early literary writing was also available to them at the time. Okay, so take this oral culture stuff, and let's also talk about the problems we have of form criticism. For example, reform criticism requires a much longer period of time between the time when Jesus died and the Gospels written down than we have already seen in our discussion of date and time. We find that the Gospels actually, early Gospels may have been written as 20, 30, possibly 40 years after the time of Jesus. Okay. The form critic has to put the Gospels on for a long time because these stories have to evolve and have to be able to be fabricated. You can't have traditional stories about Jesus that weren't true being spoken of at the same time that the apostles were around here. And that's a second problem for form criticism. It requires the belief that there was no controlling influence over the stories as they were being spread. Okay? But that's simply not true. For at least a generation, the disciples of Jesus moved among the early church in Palestine and abroad, okay? And through preaching and fellowship, they were able to confirm these stories and maintain these particular stories that were going on here. To suppose that the form critic is right is to suppose that the early disciples of Jesus were suddenly translated to heaven right after the resurrection occurred, and nobody was around to make sure that the stories were accurate in some way or another. But that's just simply not the case here. Many of the claims of the form critics are also based on speculations, okay, with little or any, if any, historical evidence at all. There's a lot of speculation involved in form criticism and what they say. And finally, the criteria used by form critics may have value for authenticating a message, but it really has no value for eliminating it. For example, the criteria of multiple attestation, well, that has value. If a story is multiply attested in independent sources, that's good. But just because a story isn't multiply attested doesn't mean necessarily it didn't happen, okay? So it has value for confirming, but it doesn't have any value for refuting or rejecting in any way at all. The last thing I want to mention in the internal evidence area has to do with the alleged contradictions. Many people will talk about that there are many contradictions in the Bible. The Bible's full of contradictions, so we're told here. Well, first of all, we need to distinguish between what's a bona fide contradiction and what's in fact a discrepancy. A contradiction is where we have two claims that are made that it's impossible for both of them to be true. That's a contradiction. However, discrepancies where we have two claims that are made and that there are significant differences or conflicts between the claims. And these differences and conflicts need to in some way be accounted for. Okay? Well, the claims or contradictions that are often made are really more discrepancies than claims. And throughout the history of New Testament critical scholarship, every apparent discrepancy has already been adequately addressed, and plausible explanations have been offered to resolve these discrepancies. It's not like the church hasn't been aware of them. Of course we are, okay? And explanations have been given for these, sometimes paraphrasing, chronological discrepancies, omissions, things like that can explain a lot of these particular supposed contradictions that are really discrepancies here. Now, that's not to deny that there aren't problems. Of course there are. There are problem passages. We've talked about that before, okay? While some passages are problematic, though, plausible explanations have been offered to explain the discrepancies. And some of these are more plausible than others, okay? And it would be wrong for me to give you the idea that all problems are easily solved. They're not. There are problems in the gospel accounts. I don't deny that we have to work on and we have to look at. But we can confidently say at least three things about this. First of all, the vast majority of explanations are sufficiently credible that one can give the document the benefit of the doubt as to substantial reliability. And remember, that's what we're trying to demonstrate, substantial reliability. Second of all, the presence of some problems doesn't mean that the document is overall generally unreliable. That's not true. All historical documents have some problems to them that we have to work through in some way or another, okay? And the third point I would say is that one would actually expect a certain amount of discrepancy in multiple accounts of events. I mean, that happens all the time. If we had a perfect parallel where all four Gospels give us exactly the same information here, well, that would be a sign of a cleaned up fabrication, okay, the collusion of some sort or another, okay? Discrepancies are actually a sign of genuineness. Well, enough about internal evidence. Let's spend the last bit of our time talking about the external evidence that we have for the reliability. External evidence examines sources outside of the gospel accounts that either confirm or refute them. Now, of the two, confirmation and refutation evidence is actually the more significant and the more important ones. If I can't confirm something, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just simply means I can't confirm it. But if I have something that refutes what somebody else says, well, now I got a problem, okay? And here's the amazing thing. When we look at the external evidence that we have some confirmation, not as much as we'd like, but we don't have any refutation. There's no refutation evidence at all, not from that time period, okay? Now, there's a common misconception concerning external evidence, and the misconception is this: we have no information about Jesus apart from the Gospels, okay? Well, while we don't have a lot of external confirmation, it's simply wrong to say we have no information at all, okay? We do have some confirmation of some major aspects of the gospel. Most importantly, though, we don't have any sources that refute gospel accounts, and that's the key thing. Now, a question that sometimes is asked, well, why don't we have more information about Jesus? You would think that if there was a great miracle worker raising people from the dead, that we'd have a lot of information about him coming from the gospel accounts here. In some way or another, there'll be a lot of stuff outside of the gospels about that particular person here. Well, there's a number of reasons why. First of all, nations and cultures of the world were much more isolated than they are today, okay? People in Rome didn't know about what was going on in Palestine. There was a huge isolation between that. And basically, to be honest with you, Palestine, Judaism, was actually a very minor country in the Roman Empire, very small. And Jesus was a very minor figure in a very minor country. So naturally, there isn't a lot of information about him. We just don't have that, okay? Also, writing was not just as pervasive as it is today. Very few people knew how to read, and even fewer knew how to write. So we don't have a lot of that being done there. And a large amount, third point, is a large amount of historical writing has simply disappeared. We're told about other books that are out there, other writings that were out there, that we can't find anywhere. For example, we're told that there was a book called The Acts of Pilate that tells us about what Pontius Pilate did while he was in Jerusalem. That would be a great find if we could find that archaeologically. But it's just simply not out there. It's just simply disappeared. However, compared to other major historical figures of ancient times, there's a surprisingly significant amount of information about Jesus outside of the Gospels. The first external source that I want to mention are the epistles of Paul. These are often ignored by Jesus' critics, and yet Paul's epistles provide us with independent confirmation about Jesus. Keep in mind, Paul probably never saw a gospel, so he didn't get his information from the Gospels. He got his information from other places, okay? And his information goes along with what we have in the gospel accounts here. There's 4 reasons why Paul's epistles are valuable. Okay, first of all, the Pauline epistles are our closest sources to information about Jesus. They predate the Gospels. Okay, Paul wrote his epistles starting probably in the late 40s with Galatians or 1 Thessalonians. One of those two was the first one. Late 40s. Okay, through the 50s, Paul was writing his epistles. Okay, so we have very early information here about Jesus in those epistles here. Second of all, Paul's epistles have broad, multiple attestation. We have multiple attestation. They're tested other places. That's good. That's an important criteria. They're confirmed by what we have here. Third, Paul attests several times that his information came from apostolic tradition, apostolic eyewitnesses. He talked about how he got his information from the apostles, the ones who were with Jesus at the time here. And the fourth value of Paul's epistles is Paul's letters point to an early and shared conviction in the church of an exalted view of Jesus. See, the critics will argue, well, they didn't think about Jesus being God until many, many years later when these stories developed, okay? But Paul shows that the view of Jesus being God, this exalted, was actually very, very early in church history. The early church thought this immediately, and we see that from Paul's writings. Now, there's 2 kinds of evidence from Paul's epistles that I want to mention. First of all, there's what we call incidental history. Okay, history comes in 2 forms, intentional and incidental. Intentional history is where somebody's actually writing a narrative account of a historical event, a biography, for example. The Gospels and Acts are intentional history, okay? Incidental history is where somebody might mention a historical event just casually in his writings, okay, assuming that his audience already is aware of the event. And the amazing thing about Paul is that Paul actually incidentally writes about Jesus' and certain events in Jesus' life, assuming that his audience is already aware of that, okay? There's a value in incidental history because incidental history is innocent of any bias. There's no agenda here. I'm not trying to convince somebody that something is true. I'm assuming you know about this, and I just simply raise it, okay, as part of that. Paul casually mentions certain things such as that Jesus has a brother named James, that he washed the disciples' feet, that he instituted communion, that he was crucified, that he was buried, that he resurrected. Okay, and he mentions these as if his audience already is aware of these things. He's not trying to sell these historical events. They're already aware of them. Okay, there's value in incidental evidence. The other evidence that comes from Paul is his use of creeds and hymns in his document here. Okay, Paul did something that maybe you've done at one time or other. He wrote the words of a song or the words of a poem, like you might write in a letter to somebody. He wrote that actually in his epistles. We find that. Okay, these creeds and these hymns, and New Testament scholars are actually able to locate these. For example, Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 8, or 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8. Okay, we find these hymns or creedal statements. These predate Paul, meaning they were before Paul wrote his epistles. Now, Paul wrote his epistles within just 15 to 20 years of the time of Jesus. These creeds were around before that. That means that they were written early on, and they give us an exalted view of Jesus concurrent with what the gospel stories tell us. Apart from the Pauline epistles, there are other external evidence that we have as well. For example, we have ancient non-Christian sources, okay? Roman historians like Tacitus and Suetonius, for example, who tell us certain things about Jesus, that they heard about Jesus. Again, they never saw a gospel, so this is independent of the Gospels, and it confirms that, okay? We have Jewish sources, okay? For example, Josephus and the Talmud say certain things about Jesus as well, and confirm certain facts of his life. Now, they don't give us all the details, and I want to make sure you understand that. I don't want to overstate my case here, okay? But they do give us some substantive things. Most of these sources talk about how Jesus was crucified. They'll talk about stories of the resurrection. They're not claiming that he was resurrected, they don't know, but they'll say there were stories about his resurrection that were going on at that particular point. Okay, so we have these kinds of sources. And then, of course, we have ancient sources that are Christian sources, but they're non-biblical. Here we're talking about the church fathers. These are people who took the information that they'd heard about Jesus and wrote about that as well. And they confirm also much of the historicity here, okay? Now, they confirm, what the church fathers do is they confirm that within a generation of Jesus, already the stories of Jesus had been accepted as historically reliable. And finally, we have archaeology. We've never found an archaeological artifact that contradicts anything that the Bible tells us, okay? Instead, what we find confirms what the Bible tells us. And that's important. Archaeology has been the friend to biblical research and New Testament research. Now, again, not every detail has been confirmed. Of course not, okay? But a lot has been confirmed here. Dr. Gary Habermas, who wrote a book called Ancient Evidence for the Life of Jesus, okay, reports from 45 different ancient non-biblical sources. He can confirm 129 separate facts about the life of Jesus. See, many people will tell you there's nothing outside of the Gospels about Jesus, but that's simply not true. Now, again, not all of it, okay, is detailed, but we have a lot of it detailed. Well, let's sum up our argument for historical reliability if we can here, okay? When all three evidences for historical reliability are applied to the gospel accounts, we find that they pass all of the evidence here. Bibliographical tests, best manuscript evidence of the ancient world. Internal tests, strong internal evidence, the date and authorship, okay, the presence of the creeds, internal marks we've talked about, the accurate oral transmission of Judaism, okay, plausible evidence for historical reliability, and we can answer the alleged discrepancies very well here. They give evidence of a substantially accurate text. And finally, the external tests. We have Paul's epistles. We have 45 non-biblical sources, 129 confirmed facts that Dr. Habermas talks about here that all confirm the substantial historicity of Jesus here. We could be confident of a substantially accurate text with a probable degree of certainty. So while we can't prove every detail, okay, we could be confident that we have what we call general reliability. And in that end, I want to end with a quote by a very well-known New Testament critic, New Testament scholar by the name of Craig Blomberg, okay, well-known historian, New Testament historian. Blomberg says this. He says, an impressive case can be made for the general trustworthiness of the gospel and Acts via historical criticism alone. People who choose to believe more of the accounts than historical reasoning by itself can support do so by a leap of faith. But it is a leap of faith in the same direction that the vast majority of the historical evidence is already pointing. And every historian of the ancient world regularly reaches provisional conclusions about the reliability or unreliability of a given source, which then color his or her attitude to those parts of the source that can neither be confirmed nor contradiction. Because the Gospels and Acts prove reliable in so many places where they can be tested, they should be given the benefit of the doubt in those places where they cannot. We have good reasons to believe that the Gospel accounts are substantially historically reliable. Thank you.